Chapter 1751. Su Shircheng looked at Xia Mian, who was lying on the ground. His cold eyes made people shudder. He treated his beloved Hong Ku like that, not to mention Xia Mian. After a long time, he said softly, "Take her away and lock her up. Don't let her go." The subordinate asked hesitantly, "Then when will we let her go?" He reminded him, "Sir, shouldn't we keep a low profile and not kill her?" Su Shircheng glanced at the talkative man and sneered, "Just don't kill her. When she gets pregnant, we'll let her go and give her another 10 million yuan. That'll be enough for her to sell herself for a long time. As for the child in Xia Mian's belly, it might be a cat's or a dog's. That was probably what a proud woman like Xia Mian couldn't stand. She would not want the child then, and then he would destroy her again. He had to let her know how powerful she was. How dare she try to defame others when she was still young? She had to pay for what she had done. Xia Mian lay on the ground, her whole body cold. The pain in her body was nothing compared to the trembling in her heart. Only then did she realize how terrifying Su Shircheng was. She couldn't imagine how terrifying he was. He wasn't human at all. Xia Mian let out a shrill cry, but no one paid attention to her. She was dragged away without so much as a raiment for her. Xia Mian had disappeared for the time being. The people from King Entertainment couldn't find her, but because she had always acted like a big shot, she didn't attract much attention. It was fine that they couldn't find her after searching for a few times. No one expected that Xia Mian would be locked up and humiliated in such a way. Su Shircheng called Linda. Linda was the confidant he had arranged to stay by Yi Liangqiu's side. He had to ask her about it at a critical moment. Linda's heart trembled from the moment she stepped into Su Shircheng's house, but she pretended to be calm. Su Shircheng was sitting. He hadn't fully recovered and was very weak. He took a sip of tea and glanced at his assistant. Then he said slowly, "Linda, you've been with me for several years, haven't you?" Linda's voice softened. "Yes, I've been with you since I graduated." Su Shircheng grunted indifferently and raised his eyes. His gaze was somewhat sharp. "How did I treat you?" Linda's heart skipped a beat. Usually when a boss asked you this, it meant that you had to pick a side. She was in a dilemma, but Mr. Yi had told her to not hide anything from him. Linda squeezed out a smile. "President Su is very good to me. Now the CEO of ATV is your Mr. Yi." Su Shircheng smiled slightly, but his eyes were full of probing. "Are you still willing to follow me?" "Follow him?" Linda was confused. What did he mean? Su Shircheng smiled and said seriously, "My wife and I have long existed in name only. I want to marry you, Linda. Are you willing?" Linda was stunned. Her smile froze on her face and she couldn't recover for a long time. After a long time, she finally came back to her senses. She probably felt that she was being too deliberate, so she coughed lightly and said, "I have a boyfriend." Su Shircheng let out an own sound and then asked in a pleasant tone, "What do you do?" "I do software," Linda said, bracing herself. Su Shircheng smiled slowly. "I haven't heard you mention it. Is he a new friend?" Chapter 1752. Su Shircheng thought for a while and said, "Not yet." He thought for a moment and said, "Linda, as long as you marry me, I'll reward you with 100 million yuan if we can have a son." 100 million yuan? Have a child? Linda wanted to curse in her heart. Did he think she was a hen that laid eggs? However, she still pretended to be shy and said, "President Su, he and I have already done it. I don't care." Su Shircheng was very generous in this regard, as if he only cared if she could give birth to a son. Linda blurted out, "But I'm pregnant." "Pregnant?" Su Shircheng looked at her flat tummy and frowned. "You were fine. How did you get pregnant?" "It's been more than a month," Linda said in fear and even reached out to touch her belly. Su Shircheng looked unhappy, but he still snorted and said, "You're the unlucky one. Also, as a girl, you should behave yourself. It's not good to get pregnant after knowing each other for only half a year." Then, as if he didn't want to talk to her anymore, he waved his hand and let her leave. When Linda left, her heart was pounding. She covered her chest and thought, "No. It's okay if Su Shircheng dies now. If he doesn't die now, what if she doesn't have a child? She has to have a child. Linda left in a hurry, and Su Shirching was anxious. He didn't have much time left, and Liang Qiu was obviously unreliable. And he desperately wanted a child. He went for a checkup, and there was still hope for him to have a child. So, he thought of Linda, but Linda said she was pregnant. Su Shirching thought of Xia Mian. If that woman was pregnant with his child, and she was so greedy, she would definitely protect the ATV and pass everything to her child. Su Shirching narrowed his eyes and made a decision. He found an obstetrician and hung Xia Mian upside down for a day. Because she had sex with another man before, he forced her to drink Chinese medicine. He was afraid that it would hurt the child, so he used Chinese medicine. He cleaned her inside and out, took a milk bath, changed her into pajamas, and sent her to Su Shirching's room. She probably wanted to give birth to a healthy and adorable child. This time, Su Shirching was especially gentle. He gave Xia Mian a lot of warmth, but Xia Mian still wanted to throw up. In the end, she really vomited. Lying on the edge of the bed, she vomited. Because she was disgusted by Su Shirching's old face, disgusted by his hands, disgusted by his everything. She was not an idiot. Everything he had done indicated that he wanted her to get pregnant with his child. Xia Mian threw up. She had never felt so disgusted before. However, she had obviously angered Su Shirching. He looked at her coldly and grabbed her. "Give me a child or you won't be able to live." His skinny fingers pinched her chin as he coldly said. Xia Mian's gaze fell on his face, and she couldn't move for a long time. Su Shirching tortured her to death, hoping that he could give birth to a child. In the end, he let go of her, as if he was throwing away goods. There were also doctors who performed maintenance work on her, all for the sake of making her pregnant. However, her treatment was much better. She was moved from a cold and gloomy room to a luxurious bedroom. Su Shirching would call her over every night and torture her more or less. Chapter 1753. Xia Mian was unwilling to be watched. She didn't want to be pregnant with Su Shirching's child, but she couldn't get any contraceptive drugs. Finally, her gaze fell on the guard. They were two young and strong men. Didn't Su Shirching want a child? Then she would have one. If he found out that the child wasn't his, would he die of anger? Xia Mian's mind wasn't clear anymore. All she could think about was revenge. Every time she came back from Su Shirching's place, she would secretly jump a few hundred times to make sure she didn't get pregnant. And of the two guards, she would always ask one of them to go to her room and do things that would make her pregnant. Su Shirching knew nothing about all this. All he wanted was to get Xia Mian pregnant and have a child. But when Xia Mian gave birth, he would let his confidant control her. And then, Liang Qiu wouldn't have to live in this world anymore. Her child would be the same as his. It wasn't good to have the Qin family's blood. When it grew up, it would always be against him. He had learned this from Liang Qiu. He hadn't gotten rid of Liang Qiu yet. On one hand, he still needed to use her to get to King Entertainment. He hadn't given up yet. He felt that Qin Anlin would never abandon Yi Liang Qiu. He would make Qin Anlin unable to let go of her again. Su Shirching leaned against the headboard and smiled coldly. Xia Mian lay beside him and carefully served him. "Mr. Su, you seem to be in a good mood today." Su Shirching put his skinny fingers on her belly and sneered. "Is there any movement here?" Xia Mian squeezed out a smile. "How can it be so fast? It's been almost a month." Su Shirching glanced at her and then lay straight. "Xia Mian, after you give birth to my child, you can have everything in the Su family, including the ATV. Didn't you give the ATV to Yi Liang Qiu?" Xia Mian asked carefully. Her heart was beating fast. She guessed something terrible. Su Shirching, this lunatic, was already planning to do something to her daughter. Su Shirching stared at her coldly. He didn't want to hide it from her. Liang Qiu is very disobedient. In this world, there was no need to keep those who were disobedient. In the past, he trusted Liang Qiu too much. He thought that there was some kinship in her heart. But no, there was no father in her heart. There was only Qin Anlin. Therefore, she had lost her value. There was no need to keep a worthless person. Xia Mian was a ruthless girl, but hearing Su Shirching's words made her hair stand on end. How cruel must he be to lay his hands on his own daughter? She carefully placed her hand on Su Shirching's neck and gently pressed her face against his chest. Shirching, I will listen to you. If you want me to have a child, I will obediently give birth to a child. Su Shirching lowered his head and looked at her. His voice was filled with tenderness. You're still the best. He patted the back of her hand, but his eyes were filled with malice. If he could get through it and live for another 10 or 20 years, there would be no need for Xia Mian to stay. Just based on the fact that she surrendered to him so quickly, this woman could not be trusted. There was already a murderous intent in Su Shirching's eyes. But Xia Mian was lying on his chest and didn't feel anything. She was still trapped in her own sweet dream. After giving birth to a child, no matter who it was, she would inherit Su Shirching's legacy. Then, she might even get king entertainment. Chapter 1754. She was going to leave one of Yi Liangqiu's dogs alive. Then, she would make Yi Liangqiu watch helplessly as she obtained Qin Anlin. Just thinking about it made Xia Mian feel relieved. But as Su Shirching said, her beauty and wisdom had nothing to do with each other. Su Shirching dismissed her and asked her to return to her bedroom. When Xia Mian returned, the two guards were already playing rock-paper-scissors to decide who would enter the room that night. However, Xia Mian had something on her mind and didn't want to deal with them, but she still asked them to enter the bedroom. Xia Mian's ambition completely conquered the two guards. Days passed by. ATV's situation was getting worse day by day. Because Qin Anlin controlled 40% of ATV's shares, he would attend ATV's shareholders' meetings from time to time. In fact, there weren't many people there. Most of the time, it was just him and Yi Liangqiu. There wasn't much content in the meetings. It was nothing more than him asking her questions about the acquisition without emotion. Yi Liangqiu only smiled faintly. President Qin, ATV hasn't reached that point yet? Do you think that 50 billion can sustain ATV for a few years? Qin Anlin sat across from her. Yi Liangqiu, ATV has thousands of employees. Including the big and small expenses, it has billions of annual expenses. How many years can you sustain it? Also, don't you think it's a waste of resources and society? There was disdain in his tone. Struggling to sustain it won't bring you any opportunities. Yes, I'm struggling. She smiled faintly. Similarly, the shares in President Qin's hands are also depreciating. You're acting on impulse. Qin Anlin reached out and took out a cigarette. Did Su Shirching allow you to do this? ATV's shares are now in my hands. Yi Liangqiu looked down. President Qin, I think I still have the final say in ATV. What do you think with the 10%? Qin Anlin said slowly. Then, under her gaze, he pushed a document to her. This is 10%. Do you want to go to the relevant department to check it? He seemed to have good intentions, but every word he said was filled with sarcasm. How could she not hear it? Yi Liangqiu looked at it for a long time before she forced a smile. President Qin is really capable. We are now on equal footing. He looked at her with a smile. I believe that if I express my stance, more employees will be willing to follow King Entertainment. At that time, Mr. Yi may not be able to do anything about it. Yi Liangqiu looked at him for a long time before she chuckled softly. She smiled bitterly. In fact, ever since the old lady passed away, she had been unable to live with herself. Whatever. She stood up and turned to look at him. Qin Anlin, I've signed the documents you wanted. After she said that, he was obviously stunned, but after thinking for a while, he understood what the document was. He stared at her for a long time, nodded slightly, and said in a low voice, Okay, there's time. Go do it. She looked at him. There's no point in dragging it out. Let's go. His gaze was still on her face, and he stared at her very closely. After a long time, he said slowly, Do you want to be with that follower for a long time? Yi Liangqiu didn't answer and walked out. As soon as she walked out, Qin Anlin's fingers forcibly snuffed out the cigarette in his hand. He didn't care that the cigarette burned him, because his body didn't hurt anymore. His heart was the place that hurt the most. Chapter 1755. When Yi Liangqiu walked to the door of her office, her body swayed. Linda quickly held her up and said worriedly, Mr. Yi, are you okay? Yi Liangqiu shook her head. I'm fine. She walked in and didn't sit down at the desk. Instead, she chose to sit on the sofa. She looked up at Linda and said faintly, How's Su Shurching? Linda pursed her lips. Mr. Yi, there's something very strange. I'm not sure if I should tell you. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and smiled faintly, but her smile was a little weak. What's wrong? Linda hesitated for a while before saying, It's Mr. Su. I went to his place a month ago, and he wanted me to marry him and have a child. Marry and have a child? Yi Liangqiu's heart sank. Had this day finally come? Linda continued, but I went there again later, and I think Xia Mian was still there. Xia Mian? Su Shurching didn't kill her? Yi Liangqiu seemed to have guessed what Su Shurching was thinking. She had seen Su Shurching's latest medical report. He would live for at least another 10 years. If he didn't die, then not only would she die, but Xia Mian would also die. After King Entertainment got their hands on her, her value to be used would end. Yi Liangqiu gently raised her chin and smiled faintly. She was laughing at herself and Su Shurching's wishful thinking. Linda kept looking at Yi Liangqiu. She was a little scared. If that day really came, she didn't know what she should do. In the evening, Yi Liangqiu and Kai met again in the same cafe. Is everything done? Yi Liangqiu asked softly. Kai's voice was low and hoarse. It's all done. President Qin didn't notice when he signed it. He looked straight at Yi Liangqiu's face. Mr. Yi, are you really not going to consider telling President Qin? He had a premonition that she was going to do something dangerous, and the person she was going to protect was Qin Anlin. Kai felt uneasy, but he was afraid that he would ruin her plan if he exposed her, so he didn't dare to act rashly. Yi Liangfeng gently shook her head. She looked at Kai for a long time, then said softly, No need. He seemed to be muttering to himself, There are some things that are better left unknown than knowing. She looked a little absent-minded, and Kai was a little worried. However, she soon came to her senses and looked at Kai. You also care about Anlin, don't you? Kai nodded passively. So, don't tell him. Yi Liangqiu smiled gently. Because I want him to be well. Kai was a little moved and said straightforwardly, I don't know why old madam is gone, but Mr. Yi, I don't want you to bear so much alone. Yi Liangqiu lowered her head and stirred the coffee in her cup. After a long time, she said lightly, If you love someone, you won't feel that it's hard. She looked up at Kai, and Kai felt a little emotional. Yes, he wouldn't feel that it was hard. It was just like how he treated Su Cheng and how Su Cheng treated him. All the sacrifices weren't hard, they were sacrifices. After a long time, he whispered, Liangqiu, you have to take care of yourself too. He guessed that in all of this, there would always be one person who would get hurt, and the person Yi Liangqiu chose was him. She should have made the decision after weighing the pros and cons, and he respected her. Yi Liangqiu nodded. Chapter 1756. Yi Liangqiu looked at him and said slowly, Don't help me. That's the biggest help. Kai was a smart man. He understood what she meant. He didn't say anything. After a long time, he sighed and left the cafe. Yi Liangqiu was still sitting there. The light from the cafe shone on her head, leaving a long shadow on the side of her face. She sat there until the coffee turned cold. Xing came in and sat opposite her. He clasped his fingers together. Su Shurching's men followed me for a long time. I had to take a detour to get rid of them. He had gone through a lot of trouble just to get Yi Liangqiu and Kai to meet. Yi Liangqiu nodded. She looked at Xing and asked slowly, Is there any movement in Ximyan's stomach? Xing hesitated for a moment and said in a low voice, My men can't get close to Ximyan. I can't know. He felt guilty that he couldn't help Miss Lin. Yi Liangqiu knew what he was thinking. She smiled faintly, It's none of your business. Su Shurching is always on guard against me. She didn't finish her words. Xing didn't know her whole plan. He was anxious. Yi Liangqiu's gaze landed on his face as he slowly said, Come here. Xing was stunned for a moment. He moved closer to her. 1 minute later, his face changed dramatically. He looked straight at Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu looked at him. Xing, do you dare? The muscles on his face twitched. After a long time, he said with a hoarse voice, "Ah Xing, there's nothing I don't dare to do." Yi Liangqiu smiled slightly. "Do you dare to go to Su Shirqing with me now?" Ah Xing looked at the time. It was 11 o'clock. Su Shirqing should be resting at this time. But he soon guessed Yi Liangqiu's intention. He nodded, "Of course." Yi Liangqiu stood up. She walked a few steps and stopped. She looked back at Ah Xing. "In the future, you must not only be brave but also smart. Do you understand?" Her life was tied to his. If Ah Xing was careless, the game would end. Ah Xing was enlightened. After a while, he patted his chest and said, "Don't worry, Missy." Yi Liangqiu went out with him, and the car drove towards the place where Su Shirqing lived in the dark. Coincidentally, when she arrived, Xia Mian was in Su Shirqing's bedroom. It seemed that she had just slept with him. Su Shirqing was in his pajamas. Xia Mian was shameless enough to stick close to Su Shirqing and look at Yi Liangqiu provocatively. She was now Su Shirqing's new favorite, and Yi Liangqiu was just an abandoned daughter. She didn't have to be afraid of Yi Liangqiu. She wrapped her fingers around Su Shirqing's neck and said in a gentle voice, "Shirqing, Liangqiu came over so late at night. She's really filial, isn't she?" Su Shirqing laughed, "Yes." He reached out and pinched Xia Mian's cheek. "You're even more obedient." Xia Mian wanted to anger Yi Liangqiu, so she put her face on Su Shirqing's arm. "I will definitely give birth to a son for you." Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. Su Shirqing was furious. Ah Xing was a little shocked. This woman is really brainless. How could she say such a thing so casually? Sure enough, Su Shirqing was angry. Brainless thing. That's how despicable people are. They only care about one night. He gave her a slap to teach her a lesson. His voice was cold. "Do you think you're qualified to give birth to my child?" Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything. She only felt that he was putting on an act too deliberately. Chapter 1757. Poor Xia Mian. She slept with the old man for so long and made him happy. But in the end, she got in the way of his plan and was slapped mercilessly. Yi Liangqiu sneered and looked at Xia Mian. Xia Mian was usually proud and arrogant. She couldn't take it lying down, especially after being humiliated in front of Yi Liangqiu. But she had to take it lying down because she was afraid of Su Shirqing. "Yes, I was wrong." Xia Mian shrank to the side and said softly. She didn't dare to be rude again. Su Shirqing looked at her for a long time and snorted. "It's good that you know your place." They were acting on the side. Yi Liangqiu and Ah Xing exchanged a look. They were just watching the show. Ah Xing finally understood why Miss Su came here so late at night. She knew Xia Mian's character. Xia Mian was wearing a white bathrobe. She fell to the side after being slapped by Su Shirqing. There were some blood stains on her white bathrobe. "Mr. Su." "Blood?" Ah Xing sounded surprised. Yi Liangqiu glanced at him, his eyes filled with praise. He was indeed much smarter. "Blood?" Xia Mian and Su Shirqing were stunned. "Blood?" Su Shirqing's attitude was completely different from before. He became nervous and called his servant, "Get the doctor here." Yi Liangqiu's eyes fell on his face. Su Shirqing couldn't let go of his wrinkled face. "It was an accident." "Dad, do you want to keep the child?" Yi Liangqiu's voice was deep and slow. There was some doubt in her eyes. Su Shirqing's eyes flickered. After a long time, he said, "It depends on fate." Xia Mian's stomach didn't hurt, but she had to pretend. She frowned and said, "It hurts." Even if Su Shirqing didn't have tender feelings for her, he would still take care of her for the sake of the child in her belly. Thus, he comforted her and allowed someone to help her up the stairs. Yi Liangqiu sat on the sofa and watched Su Shirqing go downstairs. She took a sip of tea and asked quietly, "Dad, are you going to let Xia Mian's child take over the Su family?" "Of course not." Su Shirqing's voice was gentle. "The child is still young. Liangqiu, he won't take anything away from you." "Is that so?" Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Her expression was obviously disheartened. However, Su Shirqing's mind was on Xia Mian's belly. With the bleeding, she must be pregnant. He had made up his mind to protect this child. Only by protecting this child could he take the risk to carry out his plan. The doctor came over in half an hour. When he came, his expression was a little serious. You have to stay in the hospital for observation. I'm afraid Miss Ya's pregnancy is not very stable. Su Shircheng was surprised and happy. She was happy that she was pregnant, but she was surprised that the fetus was not stable. Therefore, she could not hide her panic and even personally sent her to the hospital. Yi Liangqiu brought a Xing along with her. When he arrived at the hospital, Su Shircheng suffered a serious blow. That child was an ectopic pregnancy. Su Shircheng was stunned. Xia Mian was also stunned. Ectopic pregnancy? How could it be? After the male doctor finished his examination, he took off his mask and said emotionlessly, "Recently, the pregnant woman has been having sex too frequently. Also, she may have been a little indiscreet in this area, resulting in this result." "You're lying." Xia Mian was still on the examination table, yelling at the doctor. She almost went crazy and wanted to tear the doctor's mouth apart. Chapter 1758. The doctor ignored her. He had seen too many women like her. Wasn't it just for money? Xia Mian, right? She followed an old man. Perhaps this old man could not satisfy her, so he climbed over the wall. As soon as Xia Mian got out of bed, Su Shircheng slapped her across the face. She fell heavily on the bed. Then she felt a pain in her stomach, as if something was about to flow out. Xia Mian clutched her stomach, unwilling to give up. She turned around and half knelt in front of Su Shircheng. With tears streaming down her face, she said pitifully, "Mr. Su, he's just talking nonsense. I didn't do it with anyone else. I stayed at home every day and didn't go anywhere." Su Shircheng looked at the sweat on her forehead and was furious. He sneered, "Is that so? Then there are no men in the villa?" She really had the guts to seduce his people in his place and try to give birth to a child that was not his. He could tell what she was planning just by thinking about it. Xia Mian's back was almost broken by Su Shircheng's strike with his cane. Xia Mian couldn't stand it anymore. She lay on the examination table with blood dripping from the corner of her mouth. Her hair was wet with sweat and stuck to her forehead. She looked pitiful. But compared to what she had done, it was hateful. Yi Liangqiu looked at her without any expression on her face. She just looked at Xia Mian quietly. She was just one of the women Su Shircheng wanted to ruin. There was nothing special about her. Xia Mian lay there, her body twitching like a fish on the verge of death. Su Shircheng didn't bother to look at her and went out first. "Get rid of this woman's evil child." Xia Mian's whole body trembled. She couldn't say a word. Her lips moved slightly. Her sweet dream was so short, and this man was so heartless that it made her hair stand on end. Yi Liangqiu said quietly, "Xia Mian, you're not pregnant, let alone an ectopic pregnancy." Xia Mian was stunned. She opened her eyes and stared at Yi Liangqiu. She couldn't believe her words. "Yui is here, don't you know?" Yi Liangqiu chuckled. Xia Mian was still staring at her. After a while, she understood. "You found that doctor?" "Yes." Yi Liangqiu said bluntly. "I was the one who found them. I'll let him operate on you later." Hearing that, Xia Mian's whole body trembled. She stared at Yi Liangqiu and said, "You're so cruel. What do you want to do? Do you want to cut off my purple palace so that I can never be a woman for the rest of my life?" Her voice was extremely shrill. She struggled to get out of bed and clutched Yi Liangqiu's neck. "I'm going to kill you." "What?" Yi Liangqiu sneered. "What are you going to fight with? Because of your disappointing stomach?" She leaned close to Xia Mian and whispered in her ear, "Or are you going to mess around with those men to fight me?" Xia Mian laughed. She laughed crazily. "Yi Liangqiu, how much cleaner are you than me?" She looked at Xing. "You did something shameful with your lackeys. President Qin doesn't want you anymore. You must be very sad now, right?" Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything. Xing couldn't help it. He grabbed Xia Mian's arm and threw her aside forcefully. Xia Mian's head hit the wall, leaving a bloody mark. Chapter 1759. Then she laughed softly and tilted her head. "Yi Liangqiu, just you wait. Do you think you can do whatever you want?" She was going to tell Su Shirching that it was all Yi Liangqiu's plot. She wasn't pregnant, but she would beg him to give her a chance. Xia Mian walked quickly. When Xing wanted to catch up with her, Yi Liangqiu stopped him. Let her go. Xing looked out of the window. Mr. Su's car hasn't left yet. What if she catches up with him now? Yi Liangqiu sat on a chair and smiled. I'll let her catch up with him. It doesn't matter if she can't catch up with him. She will chase after him. Anyway, she won't give up until she reaches the end of her rope. If Su Shirching wants to kill her, she'll be the one digging her own grave. It wasn't that she wanted Xia Mian to die, but Xia Mian couldn't have a child. Xing understood very quickly, and he revealed a solemn expression on his face. Downstairs of the hospital, it was late at night. It was drizzling. Su Shirching was already sitting in the car. His face was darker than the night. Sir, Miss Xia has caught up with him. The driver was about to start the car when he saw Xia Mian running down. She was barefoot and her hair was disheveled. She looked quite pitiful. But she betrayed Mr. Su. Mr. Su was angry at the moment, and now that she was in front of him, he didn't know whether she would live or die. Su Shirching sat in the car, holding his golden crutch with both hands. He waited quietly for that bitch to say something. When Xia Mian approached, she paused for a moment and then slowed down. Her clothes were wet from the rain and stuck to her body, making her feel uncomfortable. She opened the car door humbly and looked at Su Shirching's side profile. Her heart beat wildly. She pursed her lips and said with difficulty, Shirching, we've been tricked by Yi Liangqiu. Su Shirching looked up at her, and there was a hint of hesitation in his eyes. It wasn't because he trusted her, but because he didn't trust Liangqiu. That child was also ruthless, just like him. Perhaps she had already sensed his intentions, so she played a trick on Xia Mian. However, Su Shirching still looked at Xia Mian calmly and said in a low voice, What did you do? Could it be that you don't have an ectopic pregnancy and have a normal child in your belly? Xia Mian's face was covered in rainwater. She wiped it off with her hand and said hurriedly, I'm not pregnant. However, I can get pregnant immediately. I'm still young. Mr. Su, please give me a chance. She knew that her life and death depended on whether her stomach lived up to her expectations. She knew too many things, and Su Shirching would not let her off easily. She wanted to get pregnant and then think of a way to get rid of Su Shirching. She needed time, and before that, she could only rely on Su Shirching to take down Yi Liangqiu. Su Shirching pursed his lips and looked at her. It's true. Xia Mian knelt down outside. Mr. Su, please find another doctor. That doctor is in cahoots with Yi Liangqiu. But Liangqiu is my daughter. What reason does she have to harm you? Su Shirching's eyes were cold as he looked at the humble woman kneeling on the ground. But how could Xia Mian see his cold eyes? She was too naive. She was not pregnant now, so what was the use of her? He only needed to spend a few million yuan to find the best woman to carry his child. Chapter 1760. Xia Mian said anxiously, but she's always on Qin Anlin's side. I'm afraid that she and Qin Anlin will conspire against you. She knelt and moved 2 steps forward. I'm the only one who's sincere to Mr. Su. Because we're going to have a baby, aren't we? Su Shirching looked at the kneeling woman without saying a word. Upstairs, Yi Liangqiu opened the blinds and smiled. It seems that Xia Mian is good at acting. Even Su Shirching is going to be soft-hearted. Xing was a little anxious. Don't worry. It's good that Su Shirching believes her. The more he believes her, the worse Xia Mian will fall. Yi Liangqiu smiled. Fortunately, Xia Mian didn't act recklessly. Otherwise, if the baby really existed, Yi Liangqiu might really. She needed time to arrange everything. Hearing her words, Xing was finally relieved. Downstairs. Su Shirching looked at Xia Mian for a full 5 minutes before he said, Take her away. Xia Mian was ecstatic. However, she still got in the car carefully and didn't dare to stay close to Su Shirching. From what happened tonight, she knew that he was ruthless and wouldn't act rashly. Go to another hospital, Su Shirching ordered. The driver nodded and started the car. The car drove very fast. In less than half an hour, they arrived at a private hospital. Su Shircheng was also familiar with the doctor. After the examination, the doctor said to Su Shircheng regretfully, "It's outside the uterus. Do the operation in time. It'll be dangerous if it's delayed." Su Shircheng stared at Xia Mian. Xia Mian was scared out of her wits. How could it be outside the uterus? Impossible. Yi Liangqiu clearly said that she wasn't pregnant. She framed her. No, no. Xia Mian almost went crazy. She shook her head desperately. It can't be. It's a mistake. Check again. The doctor shook his head. He didn't know why Su Shircheng found such a woman. Her private life was too messy. Her internal affairs were a mess. We need to do a biopsy. It's possible that Miss Xia has some diseases, the doctor said euphemistically. Xia Mian fainted as if she had been struck by lightning. Su Shircheng looked at Xia Mian coldly. He looked at the doctor and said, "Cut it all off." Tomorrow, he would contact the media again. He wanted to completely destroy this woman. This was the end for lying to him. The doctor hesitated, but the driver immediately handed him a check of 10 million yuan. Do it cleanly. Su Shircheng turned around and left, his heart full of anger. At the moment he was already planning to find another woman, but he couldn't wait. Perhaps he didn't need to wait until he had children. He could deal with Liang Qiu and King Entertainment first. When he got home, he would have the other way Yi and Yi would. When he returned home, Yi Liangqiu was already there. Seeing him come in, Yi Liangqiu rubbed his forehead. "Dad, how's Xia Mian?" Su Shircheng stared at her for a long time before saying, "Outside the palace." Now that the operation is over, Xia Mian can no longer be called a woman. This is her retribution. Retribution? Yi Liangqiu repeated this word and then smiled. "Dad, do you believe in retribution?" Su Shircheng's face stiffened. He couldn't get out of this embarrassing situation. "What nonsense are you spouting? Xia Mian is just a lowly woman. Don't mention her again." Chapter 1761. Su Shircheng's face darkened. He looked at Yi Liangqiu for a long time before he came back to his senses and sighed softly, "Are you thinking too much?" Yi Liangqiu smiled slightly and looked at Su Shircheng. "Dad, you know best whether I'm thinking too much or not." Su Shircheng stared at her as if he was studying her. However, Yi Liangqiu quickly smiled, "But I believe that you've seen Xia Mian's true colors." Su Shircheng was a little passive. He nodded slightly, "Yes. I'll deal with this woman." Yi Liangqiu smiled, said goodbye to him, and walked out. In the car, she tilted her head and looked at Xing. Are the two people following Su Shircheng done? Xing buckled his seat belt and said without hesitation, "Everything is done." "Don't worry," Mississippi Yi Liangqiu nodded. Xing was getting more and more reliable, so she didn't have to worry about him. The car pierced through the dark night. It was already past midnight. Everything was silent, except for people's hearts. The next day, Xia Mian made the headlines, but it wasn't a good thing. It was a scandal. She had an ectopic pregnancy with more than 2 men. In fact, she sold her body but failed to get pregnant. As a result, she was beaten up and sent to the hospital. The reporters seemed to have smelled blood. They surrounded the hospital and didn't want to leave. Xia Mian had an operation that night and woke up at 10 in the morning. The moment she woke up, she had already lost the right to be a woman. Xia Mian sat up with her hair hanging loosely and her forehead wet with sweat. She forcibly pulled out the needle from the drip, held her head with her skinny fingers, and screamed hoarsely. She felt empty all over. Something was missing from her stomach. Without it, she wouldn't be a woman anymore. She couldn't have children, no man would want her, and she would soon grow old. Her skinny fingers slowly moved to her cheeks, trembling as she stroked them, imagining that they would soon be covered with wrinkles. How could she? She couldn't. She was still young, only 23 years old. She still had a long life ahead of her. She wanted to be famous. She wanted to be a movie queen, a movie queen. She didn't want to grow old. Xia Mian beat her belly desperately, cried hoarsely, and even wanted to get out of bed. The nurse was alarmed and ran over to stop her. "Miss Xia, calm down. This is not conducive to the healing of the wound. There will be sequelae." "Sequelae?" Xia Mian's face was covered with tears. She stared blankly at the young nurse and repeated. The nurse pursed her lips and said softly, "Yes?" Xia Mian laughed so hard that tears came out of her eyes. "How can I be in a worse place?" Her voice suddenly became sharp and ear-piercing. "I don't have Zigong, I don't have our nest. I'm not a woman anymore, what else do I care about?" The nurse couldn't stop her. Soon, Xia Mian's hospital gown was covered in blood. Hearing the commotion from outside, the head nurse brought a few slender nurses over. However, the nurses were all very strong. Xia Mian had no choice but to be obedient under the pressure of 3 or 4 nurses. The head nurse's hand was pressed against the back of the patient's neck. She injected a tranquilizer into the patient, perfectly dealing with a disobedient patient. Xia Mian's body slowly softened, but her eyes refused to close. Chapter 1762. The head nurse asked someone to put her down and snorted. "I've seen a lot of women like her. Why didn't she cry or make a fuss when she was messing around?" The head nurse had been with the head nurse for a long time and often joked with her. She pursed her lips and smiled. "Head nurse, how do you know that she didn't cry or make a fuss when she was messing around? Maybe she screamed really loudly." The head nurse glared at her and said, "That's a good joke. Why is it so hard for you to write a report?" "Don't." The nurse hurriedly said, "I'll admit my mistake to the leader and I won't say such things again." She thought the head nurse wouldn't forgive her, but to her surprise, the head nurse looked at Xia Mian and sighed. "You're a beautiful girl and you used to be popular. How could you be so stupid as to become a rich man's toy?" He had even destroyed his own purple palace. This was what the head nurse couldn't understand. Couldn't she just live a good life? The nurse also sighed. "The entertainment industry is a big vat of dye. If you're popular and valuable, rich old men will throw away millions of yuan. Will you do it?" The head nurse glared at her and the nurse waved her hand. "Anyway, I'm willing to do it. It's just that I'm not as good looking as him. Go do your rounds." The head nurse knocked on her head. "Do your work properly." The nurses giggled and left, leaving only one person to watch over Xia Mian. They had been working in the hospital for a long time and had lost all sympathy for a woman like her. The most they would do was say a few words to her. When Xia Mian woke up, it was already 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She wasn't alone in the ward. There was another person she knew even if she had turned into ashes. Yiliang Qiu. Xia Mian immediately gritted her teeth. Her body was so weak that she couldn't move. She could only stare at Yiliang Qiu and say in a short voice, "What are you doing here? Are you here to laugh at me?" Yiliang Qiu sat on the sofa across from the bed. Instead of answering Xia Mian's question, she looked around and said with a faint smile, "This place is nice. My dad still has feelings for you." At the mention of Su Shirqing, Xia Mian trembled with anger. Su Shirqing was a devil. Yiliang Qiu wasn't any better. Xia Mian glared at Yiliang Qiu, her eyes burning with desire. "It was you who set me up." Yiliang Qiu chuckled. She looked at Xia Mian and said, "How can you call this a scheme? Everything is your own decision. For example, that 20 million. If you weren't greedy, why would you volunteer to serve an old man?" Xia Mian's eyes widened in shock and anger. "You arranged it?" "Yes." Yiliang Qiu smiled as she leisurely fiddled with her fingernails. "Everything was arranged by me. However, it wasn't my idea to let you have a child." "Stepmother." This form of address was really ironic. Xia Mian's pale face turned livid. At this moment, she forgot about her defects and the fact that she had just had an operation. All she wanted to do was to fight to the death with Yiliang Qiu. However, she only moved a little before she lay back down with a thud. She stared straight at Yiliang Qiu and said word by word, "I won't let you off. That's what I wanted to say to you." Yiliang Qiu narrowed her eyes and walked over slowly. Chapter 1763. Yiliang Qiu walked over slowly. Under Xia Mian's horrified gaze, she bent down and whispered into Xia Mian's ear. She whispered into his ear, "Downstairs, there are about 30 reporters waiting to report your scandals. Xia Mian, King Entertainment announced this morning that they will terminate your contract. Your acting career is completely over. Xia Mian stared at her and shook her head desperately. No, that's impossible. President Qin would never do this to me. Her eyes were wide open, and her mouth was agape. She breathed as hard as she could, like a fish without oxygen. I'm the victim. It's all your scheme. Boss Qin is so smart. He'll definitely see through your scheme, you bitch. Yi Liangqiu held Xia Mian's neck with one hand and smiled slightly. So what? So what? Xia Mian's eyes rolled gently in her eye sockets. There were tears of defiance in them. She gritted her teeth and said, I will definitely expose your true colors. Yi Liangqiu chuckled. Okay, but you have to have the chance first. Xia Mian gasped desperately. She grabbed Yi Liangqiu's collar with her fingers and said in a shrill voice, What do you want? Nothing. Yi Liangqiu gently pushed Xia Mian to the side. Xia Mian fell heavily on the bed again and stared straight at Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu smiled slightly. Now, Xia Mian, what do you think you can do? Xia Mian gasped and raised her hand. Then, she fell down powerlessly. Yi Liangqiu slowly stood up and looked down at Xia Mian. Do you know why I hate you? Xia Mian's eyes were bloodshot. She glared at Yi Liangqiu for a long time before she sneered. You just can't stand the fact that I'm deeply in love with President Qin. Then, she giggled, I like Boss Qin, and I want to sleep with him. Yi Liangqiu, you don't like it, do you? Let me tell you, there are a lot of girls in King Entertainment who want to sleep with President Qin. How is it? Does it make you uncomfortable? Yi Liangqiu wasn't as excited as she thought. She just said lightly, I care about him. If I can't be with him, then I hope he can find a good girl, not you, Xia Mian. Xia Mian's expression changed. Her mouth twitched slightly and she forced a smile. What's wrong with me? Have I never been innocent before? Yi Liangqiu's gaze was indifferent. You know he has a family, but you still want to sleep in the same room? You Xia Mian? Xia Mian bit her lips so hard that it was about to bleed. Since you're so interested in my man, I'll let you sleep with my dad. By the way, doesn't it feel good to be my stepmother? Yi Liangqiu's voice was very cold. At that moment, Xia Mian was absent-minded. Because this kind of Yi Liangqiu was too scary. Oh. She said no as she slowly moved back. After a long time, she still couldn't move. Yi Liangqiu didn't want to talk to her anymore. She smiled faintly. Your future is not up to you. Xia Mian was digging her own grave. When she cooperated with Su Shirqing, she more or less wanted to get herself killed. On Mrs. Qin's side, there was a lot of gossip around Su Shirqing. Yi Liangqiu didn't know what would happen to her, but she had to decide Xia Mian's ending. Chapter 1764. She took a step back. Then 2 nurses and a doctor pushed open the door and walked in. Xia Mian lay on the bed with fear in her eyes. She waved her hands frantically. What do you want? But no one paid attention to her. The doctor took out a tube of medicine and filled it with medicine. When he squeezed out some medicine, Xia Mian's heart trembled. Then she struggled with all her might. The 2 nurses held her down with great strength. She instinctively knew that they weren't nurses. These 3 people were hired by Yi Liangqiu to deal with her. Xia Mian wanted to scream, but the next second, her mouth was covered. Her eyes widened as she struggled. She watched in horror as the doctor walked closer and closer with the syringe in his hand. Xia Mian, I believe that I should let you know the reason, so that before you retain the last shred of clarity, you will know the truth. Yi Liangqiu stood ramrod straight, his voice flat and without the slightest change. Yes, she admitted that she was cold-hearted and cruel. She wasn't doing this just for Qin Anlin. It wasn't a big deal if he was slept with, but she had to think about her 3 children. Would Xia Mian harm her children in the future? Therefore, the best outcome for Xia Mian was to go crazy and be locked up in a mental hospital. Xia Mian struggled with all her might. She wanted to break free, but she was firmly held down. The doctor's eyes were cold and merciless. She would never forget them. Her life's memories weren't of Yi Liangqiu or Qin Anlin, but of the doctor's eyes. As soon as the thin needle pierced into Xia Mian's arm, her eyes widened as if they were going to pop out. She gasped for breath, her body trembling and twitching. When the syringe was injected, her strength suddenly increased. She struggled to break free from the nurses around her. She covered her head and screamed and gasped for breath. It hurt so much. It felt like someone had smashed it open. She held her head tightly with her hands, curled up into a ball, and rolled on the bed, her body split open. Her head, her heart, and her entire consciousness were separated. She was no longer whole. After about half an hour, Xia Mian fell silent. She lay quietly on the bed without making a sound, and the drip on the back of her hand was connected again. It was quiet in the room. Only the faint dripping sound could be heard. Drip, drip, drip. It sounded like rain, but it sounded more like someone was crying. It was her baby. Her baby was crying. Xia Mian curled herself into a ball and kept murmuring, "It's not my fault. It's not my fault. I didn't leave you on purpose." All she could think about was the child and the doctor's eyes. That doctor was here to harm her child, to harm her and her son. Xia Mian went crazy. This news became explosive news in all the major media in B City the next day. The hospital was surrounded so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. At first, they were still cautious, but later, the reporters disguised themselves as medical staff and snuck into the hospital. However, Xia Mian had already been transferred to another hospital. Of course, it was Yi Liangqiu's arrangement. After learning that Xia Mian had gone crazy, Su Shiqing was stunned for a while. Then, he looked up at Yi Liangqiu and asked, "Did you do it?" Chapter 1765. After Su Shiqing learned that Xia Mian had gone crazy, he was stunned for a while. Then he looked up at Yi Liangqiu. "Did you do it?" Yi Liangqiu didn't deny it. Isn't that a good thing? If she was sober and talked nonsense in front of the media, it would be a scandal for ATV. When she said the word scandal, Su Shiqing's face darkened, but he didn't say anything else. "You're taking revenge on a personal grudge." After a long time, he spoke again, feeling that something was wrong. This daughter of his was getting more and more difficult to manipulate. Su Shiqing had already sent someone to investigate. The paperwork between Qin Anlin and her was already being done. If something happened to her, the shares under her name and her 50 billion yuan would belong to him, not Qin Anlin. If he couldn't control someone, he might as well disappear. There was a murderous look in his eyes. Yi Liangqiu felt it, but she didn't say anything. After a long time, she said softly, "I've always hated her. At this time, it's understandable, unless you can't bear to." Su Shiqing's face fell. "I can bear to." He paused and looked up. "Is there really nothing between you and Qin Anlin?" "The paperwork is being done," she said softly. "I don't think there's a chance anymore." Su Shiqing's eyes were deep. "Liangqiu, I feel that you should try to redeem yourself." "Maybe." She looked into his eyes as if she wanted to see through him. Su Shiqing's old face was somewhat embarrassed. After a long time, he coughed softly. "I'm doing this for your own good. If you can have the best of both worlds, that would be the best." Didn't he find it ridiculous to say such things at a time like this? Yi Liangqiu lowered her eyes and chuckled. She didn't say anything. It was afternoon and dusk when she went out. She raised her hand to look at her watch, a little absent-minded. It was the time when she first met Anlin. She was still a little girl at that time. She still remembered the clothes she was wearing and how nervous she was. Her dress was almost wrinkled and her palms were sweaty. She could still remember the expression on his face and the stifled gasps of his breath the first time he took her. She could remember everything, but everything was about to disappear. Everything was coming to an end. She personally ended it. Su Shiqing said that she would try to salvage the situation, but she didn't want to. She would rather he hate her. If she had to leave, at least he wouldn't feel so bad. What he lost was an enemy, not a lover. The setting sun shone on her face, making her skin look like it was floating in a layer of light, making her look more beautiful than ever. Her fingers gently caressed her face. Her skin was very good, but her heart had already been through so much, so much. It was about to end. The painful days were about to end. Whether Qin Pei lived or died, she would do her best. She would also work hard to live so that everyone could live well. But now, she only wanted to see one person. She had seen the people she had loved and would love in the future. Anlin. She wanted to see him. Even if he hated her, she still wanted to see him. When she saw him again, it was already night time. It was at the entrance of his apartment. The children weren't there, and he was the only one at home. Chapter 1766. Qin Anlin's gaze paused and he looked straight at her. It had been almost 10 years since the last time she had worn this dress. With her hair tied up in a ponytail, she looked much younger and more innocent. Qin Anlin vaguely realized that it had been a long time since she had tied her hair up in a ponytail. They hadn't been in such a good mood for each other. She was no longer a 19-year-old girl. She was more mature, but at this moment, her eyes still carried a hint of cautiousness as she looked up at him. She didn't have a place to sit outside, so she squatted in the corner, looking a little pitiful. Qin Anlin glanced at her and didn't bother with her. He took the key and opened the door. When the door opened, he walked inside and didn't bother with her. Just as he was about to enter the door, Yi Liangqiu reached out and grabbed his arm. Qin Anlin turned his head and looked at her. Yi Liangqiu let go? No, she said softly and shamelessly. Then, she stared at him with her watery eyes. Qin Anlin's arm struggled and she used some strength. He didn't manage to break free, so he looked a little exasperated. He looked at her coldly and said, Yi Liangqiu, what exactly do you want? She lowered her head and looked up at him again. Can I stay here for the night? She placed her hand on his arm, as though she could feel the vibrations in his body. Qin Anlin's face was a little angry. He stared at her for a while. She thought that he wouldn't agree. She opened her mouth slightly and was about to say something, but he spoke first. His voice was very calm. Up to you. She couldn't believe it, but she still followed him in quietly. When they entered, the lights weren't turned on and it was dark inside. Just when she wanted to turn on the lights, the sound of him closing the door was very soft. Then she felt a pain in her back and the back of her head. Her whole body was pressed against the door. Tightly pressed against her was his hot body. It was so hot that it seemed like it was going to melt her. In the darkness, everything was magnified and magnified. His fingers were scorching hot as they caressed her red lips. His voice was low and husky. Yi Liangqiu, I don't know your motive, but do you know why I let you in? At this moment his body was very hot. How could she not know what he was thinking? Or perhaps it wasn't just thinking, but what he wanted to do. Zhang Xian's body trembled slightly as he raised his head and smiled. I know. Qin Anlin kissed her lips angrily. He kissed her fiercely. She wanted to struggle, but his hands clasped her hands and raised them above her head, restraining her. His lips left her slightly, and his breath was slightly messy. He stared at her in the darkness. Yi Liangqiu, we are no longer legal now. Are you sure? Before she could reply, his voice rang out again, I won't take responsibility, and I won't go easy on you just because I did it with you. Her body leaned against the door, her eyes as light as water, like the white moonlight. She raised her head and smiled gently. I thought you wouldn't betray me, right? It was better if she didn't mention it. The moment she mentioned it, his entire body turned cold as he stared at her coldly. After that, it was a storm that she couldn't bear. It was as though he had gone crazy. It was like the end of the world, as though he wanted to crush her. The last time was in the bathroom. Chapter 1767. He was very tired, but he didn't care. He just stood there quietly. He regretted it, but at that time, he couldn't control it. Yi Liangqiu sat up slowly and got off the bed with the bedsheets wrapped around her. She walked behind him and hugged him gently. Anlin. She put her face on his back. You've forgiven me, haven't you? His body trembled. After a while, he said slowly, no. He had said long ago that having sex with her once didn't mean anything. However, he didn't understand what she meant, nor did he know the purpose of her visit tonight. She put her face on his back and said softly, be good in the future. Qin Anlin suddenly asked with difficulty, "What do you like about him?" Yi Liangqiu was stunned for a moment, then she realized that he was talking about Xing. She smiled softly. "He's good. There's nothing bad about him." "Is it that simple?" He wasn't as angry as before, probably because he had to separate from her. He turned around and patted her. "Go to sleep, we'll leave tomorrow morning." With that, he walked out of the bedroom. He walked out in a straight line, while she stood alone in the dark. Behind her, there was a large floor-to-ceiling window. Her figure was upside down on the glass, looking so lonely. Her body, which was hot because of him, had long cooled down, slowly. That night, she didn't sleep. She stayed at the place where they used to live together, touching every inch of the furniture and every piece of the bedsheets. He was just next door, but she felt that they were very far apart. Her fingers touched the pillow gently. It was his, and there was his scent on it. She put her face on it and sniffed it softly. Loving him had become a habit, and it was deep in her bones. A drop of hot tears slowly slid down from the corner of her eyes and fell on the pillow. On the other side, Qin Anlin was in the study. The door was closed, and there was smoke inside. The ashtray on the study table was full of cigarette butts. He didn't know why she was here, but no matter how much he hated her and how much he didn't want to be involved with her, he couldn't deny that he still couldn't forget her. So be it, after tonight, tomorrow is a stranger. His fingers picked up the document in the drawer. He squinted his eyes and looked at it for a long time. In the end, he put it back in the drawer. Late at night, he walked out of the study and walked to the door of the master bedroom, but he did not enter. He just stood by the door and looked at the dim light coming from inside. His face was a little gloomy. After standing there for about 10 minutes, he finally left and went to the guest room. Inside the room, Yi Liangqiu heard footsteps. She lay on her stomach and buried her face into the pillow. At dawn, Qin Anlin opened his eyes. Throughout the night, he had only slept for more than an hour. Now that he was awake, the house was quiet. However, he could keenly sense that she was no longer here. She had left. He stood up and walked briskly to the entrance of the master bedroom. His footsteps grew faster and faster. The door to the master bedroom was wide open. Everything inside was the same as before, except for her aura. His hand was propped up against the door. His face and eyes were empty, devoid of any spirit. After looking for a long time, he suddenly walked back to the study. When he opened the drawer, the document was no longer there. His face instantly turned ashen. He looked at the drawer for a long time, closed it, and sat there smoking a cigarette. Chapter 1768. The last straw of their relationship had been destroyed by her. She had come here because she had caught wind of what was going on. So, she had used the trick of going to bed with him just for this document? It was ironic just thinking about it. He didn't want to think about her true motives. He closed his eyes and smiled bitterly. It had finally come to an end. Because of the contract that Yi Liangqiu had gotten back, King Entertainment had suffered a huge loss, and Qin Anlin had taken responsibility for this loss. The next time they met was at a celebrity gathering, which was actually an auction in disguise. It had only been 3 days since the night they had parted. But 3 days later, there was someone else by his side. It wasn't someone with heavy makeup, but a fresh and lovely girl. She couldn't be more than 25 years old, and she looked very gentle. Yi Liangqiu saw them walking side by side in the atrium of the hotel. What made her realize their relationship was Qin Anlin's jacket. The girl was wearing a light pink evening gown. Perhaps it was a little cold at night, but Qin Anlin's jacket was draped over her shoulders, and he allowed the girl to put her hand on his arm. Yi Liangqiu went to the restroom and bumped into them. She knew this girl. She was the daughter of a medium-sized company. She came from a good family and ran an art gallery at a young age. She wasn't Qin Anlin's cup of tea, but Yi Liangqiu thought that it should be the person that Qin Anlin had considered carefully. It was the person that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. Her heart felt like it had been pierced by countless needles. There was an indescribable pain in her heart. She desperately told herself, "Yi Liangqiu, it's okay. As long as you're alive, you still have a chance." You can take him from someone else by hook or by crook. Even if you're severely injured, you won't give up. Yi Liangshui walked over slowly. She was wearing a white evening gown. She looked the best in white, and no one was more suited to it than her. He walked slowly and finally came face to face with them. When the girl named Shenrua saw her, she instinctively tightened her grip. However, she still maintained a calm expression on her face. She raised her head and said in a gentlemanly manner, "Anlin, do you need some time alone?" "Anlin?" Yi Liangqiu smiled in her heart. Sure enough, the relationship was in place. She thought that it was impossible for there to be such progress in the past 2 or 3 days. It was very likely that they had been in contact before. While she was thinking, Qin Anlin's gaze fell on her face. He replied to Shenrua, "No need. There's nothing to say." This answer obviously pleased his new girlfriend. Shenrua had a faint look of satisfaction on her face as she nodded towards Yi Liangqiu in a reserved manner. However, Yi Liangqiu said softly, "Anlin, did you see an earring on the bed? I lost one a few days ago. Maybe it's with you." His words carried great weight, and they carried great lethality. Shenrua's face changed immediately. That pink bubble on her face and in her heart disappeared immediately as her face fell. Qin Anlin was much calmer as he looked at Yi Liangqiu indifferently. "I didn't see it." These words were equivalent to a solid confirmation that Yi Liangqiu had spent the night in his apartment that night. Shenrua's face turned pale for a moment and then red for a moment. She was furious. Chapter 1769. Hearing Qin Anlin's words, Shenrua felt much better, even though she knew it was fake. This showed that this man cared about her. At least, he had made a choice between her and Yi Liangqiu. That was enough. Yi Liangqiu was still smiling. "I'm asking about the guest room." Her tone sounded a little confused, and it didn't seem out of place on her usually cold face. Qin Anlin's face finally turned green. He was sure that she did it on purpose. He pursed his lips and looked at her sideways for a long time before saying calmly, "No." Shenrua's face fell again. She watched as Yi Liangqiu walked past her. She let go of Qin Anlin. He seemed to be indifferent and didn't want to coax her anymore. Because his gaze was still on his ex-wife. His face was full of nostalgia, and the deep love and pain in his dark eyes made Shenrua's teeth hurt. After a long time, the woman who was throwing a tantrum finally held his hand again and said with grievance, "Let's go in." No matter what, she didn't want to give up on Qin Anlin. Apart from his good looks, his wealth was enough to make all the women go after him. Qin Anlin took out a cigarette with one hand and put it on his lips to smoke. Shenrua wanted to say that she couldn't stand the smell of smoke, but after thinking about it, she endured it. From now on, she was destined to fail. Qin Anlin never wanted women who submitted to him. This kind of forbearance doomed their relationship to be completely devoid of joy. As a result, even after so long, their emotional state was still stuck at the stage of putting on a show on the outside. Qin Anlin finished smoking and then walked out of the venue. There weren't many people, about 40 to 50 people, and they were all famous people in City B. Although these people didn't usually gossip, seeing Qin Anlin come with a girl, and Yi Liangqiu was also present, it was worth watching. It was quite dark inside, and the chairs were comfortable sofas, either for 2 or several people. They were placed in the living room. The lights were dim, but when they walked in, they could still feel the luxury inside. Shenrua pulled the hem of her skirt and sat down with Qin Anlin uncomfortably. She still subconsciously looked for Yi Liangqiu's seat and found that there were 2 small sofas between her and Qin Anlin's seat, where he could directly see Yi Liangqiu. She pursed her lips and softly said, "Anlin, let's change seats." She lowered her voice. "I'm wearing high heels. I can take them off inside. No one will see." Qin Anlin gave her a meaningful look. He didn't say anything and switched places with her. Shenrua's skirt was probably too long, so when she got up, she fell towards him unsteadily. Qin Anlin caught her, and from a certain point of view, it was as if he was holding Shenrua in his arms. And from this point of view, it was Yi Liangqiu's point of view. She just smiled faintly, and a slight smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. How could she not know Shenrua's little trick? She didn't care, but when Qin Anlin sat down, he deliberately looked towards her side. When he found that she wasn't looking at him, a trace of anger rose in his heart. Shenrua put her hand on the back of his hand, and her voice was gentle. I heard that there will be an auction tonight. It's Zhang Daqian's, and President Li donated it. Chapter 1770. Shenrua hummed softly and didn't stand on ceremony. She knew that 100 million was nothing to Qin Anlin. What mattered was his sincerity and his stance in front of Yi Liangqiu. Women have no sense of security. Shenrua was the epitome of this. Qin Anlin didn't say anything else and just looked at the stage. Tonight's banquet began in the form of a banquet, with the president of a certain chamber of commerce and his wife dancing. In fact, the organizers had privately contacted Qin Anlin and asked him to dance, but he refused. On the stage, after the dance ended, there was a round of applause. The president's wife smiled sweetly and returned to her seat with the president. The president and his wife are so loving. Shenrua smiled and looked at Qin Anlin. Anlin, don't you think so? Qin Anlin picked up the wine in front of him and said calmly, the president has at least 3 people outside, and 5 or 6 illegitimate children. Shenrua was stunned. After a while, she said embarrassedly, then his wife must not know. She knows. Qin Anlin's tone was still very calm. Shenrua felt uneasy. She felt that he was hinting at something. After a long time, she finally couldn't hold it in and asked in a low voice, Anlin, would you do this? Would you embarrass me like this? Do you have anyone outside? Qin Anlin's gaze was as calm as water as it fell on her face. It's hard to say what will happen in the future. There wasn't even a guarantee. Shenrua's heart seemed to freeze. She knew about Qin Anlin's past. He was very promiscuous before he got married, and the entire King entertainment was his harem. But he was very single-minded after he got married, so she naturally thought that he would be the same after they got married. Shenrua's face froze for a while. At this moment, she wanted to leave. She wanted to turn around and leave, to show her disdain, to show that she didn't need him. But after a long time, she still sat where she was and pretended that the conversation just now hadn't happened. Yes, she gave in. Even if he became that president in the future, she would still be with him. However, her mood was a lot worse. It was only when the painting was auctioned that she felt a little better. At that time, Shenrua realized how good it felt to be pampered by a man. When a man raised his placard and called out 10 million, 20 million, 50 million, 80 million, 100 million just for her, he was so handsome. For some reason, the painting, which was worth less than 100 million yuan, was raised to 200 million yuan. Perhaps everyone present was making fun of Qin Anlin, making fun of him for getting a new favorite. Under those ambiguous gazes, Shenrua's mood became much better. When the bid reached 200 million, they thought that no one else would fight for it, but Yi Liangqiu raised her paddle and said, 300 million. Everyone turned to look at her. Because her identity was so mysterious, everyone was wondering if Mr. Yi was deliberately targeting President Qin's new favorite. That's why he stood out. At this moment, if President Qin didn't raise his bid, he wouldn't look like a man, and it would be hard to explain to his new favorite. Hence, a drama unfolded between the new and old lovers. A lousy painting was called out to 1 billion yuan. Shenrua's heart was about to jump out of her chest. She had originally thought that spending 100 million would be enough, just to express his love. But 1 billion yuan, he could give her 1 billion yuan. Chapter 1771. 1 billion, it was Yi Liangqiu who called it. Qin Anlin's hand moved, wanting to raise it again, but Shenrua grabbed his hand. In the end, she still couldn't bear to part with money. She said in a low voice, I don't want it. Money was more important than her face. Qin Anlin's gaze fell on her face quietly. Are you sure? Shenrua nodded. He put away the sign and said indifferently, don't you like this painting very much? If you like something, don't you want to get it at all costs? Just like Yi Liangqiu, she would do anything to get it. Even if she had to bleed, even if she had to hurt her enemy or herself, she would not hesitate. Shenrua smiled lightly and said 2 words, "It's not worth it." Not worth it? Qin Anlin chewed on these 2 words and suddenly realized that not all women were like Yi Liangqiu. Not all women were like moths to a flame like her. There was only one Yi Liangqiu. And Shenrua was just one of the millions of women who liked money and his appearance. He suddenly felt bored, but he did not push her away. Yi Liangqiu went on stage and accepted the painting. She donated 1 billion without blinking her eyes. In fact, this was also Qin Anlin's money. She took the microphone and smiled slightly. "I donate my love. Besides, I don't really like this painting of Zhang Daqian. Now, I will start the bidding with 1 yuan. I hope that the person who likes it can take it home." The host was very surprised. He did not expect that Mr. Yi could make such a small mockery and praise. It was nothing more than Mr. Ye's generosity. But in his heart, he was cursing. If he didn't like it, why would he bid? By doing this, he was deliberately making life difficult for President Qin and his little girlfriend. Now, he even humiliated them a little. Come to think of it, President Qin's little girlfriend had not been promoted to the official position, and Mr. Ye's authority as the official wife was still there. Therefore, the bidding started. However, no matter how cheap it was, Shenrua couldn't raise the sign, because it would only make Qin Anlin lose face. She still had a sense of propriety. In the end, the painting was bought by the president's wife for 13,000 yuan, which could be considered as someone else's modesty. Yi Liangqiu became the good person while Shenrua gritted her teeth. Qin Anlin wasn't surprised by this result. After all, the president's wife was an elder on Yi Liangqiu's grandmother's side. In terms of seniority, she was his aunt. They didn't acknowledge each other, but they both knew each other's identities. This favor was sold very well. Because Momo had always been well taken care of in the Chen family. At this time, Qin Anlin didn't know that Yi Liangqiu had already prepared for the worst. She had already started to arrange everything. Every step she took was sorrowful, and every glance she gave him had a deeper meaning. However, he still didn't know. Her gaze, when he couldn't see it, was filled with longing and longing. What he didn't know was that although she was angry and jealous, she acknowledged Shenrua in her heart. At least, Shenrua was a gentle woman and would be a good wife. If she wasn't around, there would be someone who would be by his side. And what she did tonight was just a little temper. Even if she wasn't around in the future, she wanted him to remember her bad side. Remember, even if Yi Liangqiu was bad, she was different. Chapter 1772. Qin Anlin paused for a moment, then turned his head and looked at Yi Liangqiu on the stage. On the stage, the lights were shining. She stood there, beautiful as ever. He never doubted that as long as she was given a stage, she would be the most dazzling star. Even now, when he looked at her, his heart still moved. His body stopped, unable to move a step. Time seemed to be frozen. He was below the stage and she was on the stage. He needed to look up at her. After a long time, she held the microphone and said, "I want to donate this diamond ring on my finger. Everyone here should know her. Her name is Pink Beauty." The host was also confused. Miss Yi said she wanted to donate her own item, but she didn't say she wanted to donate a wedding ring. Moreover, the man who gave the ring was here. Their love was gone, but this item couldn't be lost. Wasn't Miss Yi deliberately making things difficult for President Qin? This wasn't an auction, but an embarrassment. If it was auctioned, not only would it be embarrassing for herself, but it would also embarrass Miss Shen next to her. The host had been immersed in this industry for so many years. At a glance, he knew that Mr. Yi was making things difficult for President Qin. The atmosphere was a little stiff for a moment. Everyone was silently looking at the two of them. It seemed that in the whole space, everything, everyone, and everything were no longer important, and only the two of them were left. Shenrua, who was next to Qin Anlin, had long become a foil. Even if she was the female lead, she didn't have the aura of a female lead. She couldn't even be considered a supporting role. Because between people who truly loved each other, no one else could interfere, even if they were no longer together. Qin Anlin just stood there. He didn't leave, nor did he sit down. Shenrua, who was next to him, was a little anxious. She pulled him and called out softly, "Anlin," but he seemed to have not heard it, and kept staring at Yi Liangqiu on the stage. Yi Liangqiu's gaze seemed to sweep past them. She smiled faintly and continued, "This one is worth about 500 million. She lowered her eyes. "I don't need it anymore. Let's start at 100 million. The crowd was in an uproar. 100 million was really cheap, and many of the wives were eager to give it a try. After all, such opportunities didn't come by often, but they were worried about the male lead, so they were too embarrassed to make a move. The scene was silent. The scene was a little embarrassing. The host quickly took over the conversation and said some words to smooth things over, but still, no one answered. He looked at Yi Liangqiu with regret and sympathy. This was destined to be a one-woman show. But what he didn't know was that Yi Liangqiu's real intention was to provoke Qin Anlin. In this silence, Shenrua raised a victorious smile. "Yi Liangqiu, after all, you overestimated yourself. Do you think you can take back Anlin like this?" She hugged Qin Anlin tightly and said on her own, 100 million and 1 yuan. Everyone's jaws dropped in shock. It wasn't because someone had taken a photo. It was because that person turned out to be Shenrua. Just how much IQ did he have? Moreover, just how promising was this? An extra yuan? Wasn't this the same as slapping Qin Anlin's face again and again? President Qin's face was hurt by Yi Liangqiu's slap, and Shenrua slapped him on the other side. She felt sorry for President Qin for a second. Chapter 1773. As soon as Shenrua finished speaking, she sensed that everyone was looking at her. At first, she was quite complacent. She thought that it wouldn't be a problem for Anlin to spend 100 million, but those stares made her a little uncomfortable. She couldn't figure out if she had done something wrong. She raised her head and looked at Qin Anlin carefully, only to find that his face was terrible. Shenrua finally knew that she had stepped on a landmine. She tugged at Qin Anlin's sleeve anxiously, feeling a little embarrassed. In fact, from the bottom of her heart, she hoped that Qin Anlin could help her bid for it, at least she could live with it. However, he didn't mean that. He just said lightly, "Let's go." Shenrua felt wronged, but she didn't dare to say anything. She could only follow Qin Anlin. He walked quickly without any care for her. Shenrua was having a hard time chasing behind him. Even with her fingers holding his arm, she could feel his whole body tense up. She knew that in his heart, there was only the woman on the stage. But so what? Qin Anlin didn't care about Yi Liangqiu anymore. As long as she didn't make any mistakes in the future, she would become Mrs. Qin sooner or later. Qin Anlin walked to the door, and the waiter opened the door for him. Behind him, Yi Liangqiu was still embarrassed, even unbearable. A person's stage is like a person standing in an empty world, forgotten. The door opened slowly, as if he was slowly walking out of her world. The world became empty. Her world, he must have abandoned it. But at this moment, a voice sounded outside the door, 1 billion. Everyone was stunned, and their gazes fell on the door in unison. Beside the door stood a man in his 40s. He had an elegant demeanor, and his whole body carried a faint scholarly aura. Someone had already recognized that this was Du Yuesheng, the godfather of Hong Kong's entertainment industry. Why was he here? Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes and looked at Du Yuesheng. The latter's eyes also fell on him, and he smiled faintly. "President Qin, long time no see." Qin Anlin's smile was a little forced. "Indeed, I haven't seen Mr. Du for a long time." There was a hint of mockery in his tone. Because of Yi Liangqiu, Du Yuesheng now held 10% of King Entertainment's shares. Although it couldn't shake the foundation of King Entertainment, it was like having a brick in your house that belonged to someone else. You would always feel uncomfortable. Du Yuesheng smiled slightly. "It has indeed been a long time. There's a new beauty by President Qin's side." Shenrua immediately responded with a faint smile. She could tell that this Mr. Du was a person of high status, but she could not tell the subtle relationship between Du Yuesheng and Qin Anlin. Qin Anlin lowered his head and glanced at Shenrua. He didn't say anything, nor did he deny it. As for Du Yuexing, she walked straight up the stage and stood beside Yi Liangqiu. He took the microphone from her hand and said faintly, "I don't think anyone will offer a higher price, right?" As he spoke, he raised his hand, and his attendant immediately presented a check of 1 billion. And he took the pink beauty ring from Yi Liangqiu's hand and put it on for her personally. When he put it on for her, she instinctively shrank back, but nothing could escape. "I just think that this ring suits you," Du Yuexing whispered. "Liangqiu, there are so many people watching, don't make me lose face." Chapter 1774. Under such an occasion, embarrassing him would also be embarrassing herself. Moreover, she had originally wanted Qin Anlin to dislike her. What she was most afraid of was not his dislike, but her having no choice but to leave him. She stared at the ring. She could still remember the expression on Anlin's face when he put the ring on her finger that day. At that moment, he said to her in a low voice, "Liangqiu, only one person for the rest of my life." She had sacrificed far, far too much for these words. Sacrificing had become a habit, and it was hard for her to turn back. Yi Liangqiu slowly raised his eyes and looked at the door. He saw a pair of eyes that were filled with ice. His eyes were filled with coldness. Moments later, he lowered his head and glanced at Shenru. Both of them left together. Yi Liangqiu instinctively stretched out her hand and touched her abdomen. Perhaps his child would be here. She had always been unscrupulous. That night, she left herself a last way out, a reason for her to be with Anlin again. That night, it was her conception period. He forgot to use contraception, and she did not use contraception. If she was still alive, this child would be her salvation. Du Yuexing was a mature man. Looking at her actions, he guessed what was going on and smiled. His gaze fell on her face. After a long time, his gaze was nostalgic and warm, as though he was looking for something on her face. It was filled with nostalgia. His luo was the same. She was also as silly. Yi Liangqiu did not notice the gentleness in his eyes, because she only had eyes for Qin Anlin. She did not know how she walked out of the clubhouse and how she returned to the Su house. On the way, Xing told her a lot about the plan. She tried to stay alert, but she could not listen to him. She only calmed down when she reached the entrance of the Su house. She said in a calm voice, "Xing, repeat what you said one more time." Xing's eyes widened, but he still told her everything in detail. In the end, he added, "Eldest miss, I suspect that this time, Su Shurching will make it real." He paused before saying, "If Mr. Qin doesn't listen to him, I'm afraid he'll kill the hostage." Yi Liangqiu nodded. "I know." Since she had decided to fight with her back to the wall, there was no room for her to retreat. She alighted from the car and stepped on the ground. After taking a few steps, her legs felt weak. In the end, it was Xing who reached out to support her. Just like that, he walked in step by step. Every step was so difficult. She thought that she was actually not that great. The reason why she tried so hard to hide it was not only because she was afraid that Anlin would get hurt, but also because she was Su Shurching's daughter. Even if she tried to wash herself clean, she could not wash away the fact that Su Shurching's blood flowed in her body. It was an inescapable fate. She closed her eyes. She thought that Su Shurching would make his move quickly, but he didn't. Su Shurching seemed to be very calm. Xing said that recently, Su Shurching had been busy choosing girls and having children. Yi Liangqiu really wanted to see his expression when he found out that ATV had become King Entertainment. Would he still have the heart to work hard to have children? Just like that, she and Su Shurching waited. She waited for him to make his move. Days passed by, and she did not see Qin Anlin again. But she knew in her heart that she had pushed him towards Shenrua, step by step. If it wasn't Shenrua, it would be someone else. Chapter 1775. Guan Xianzhao had come out and Shenrua was sitting beside him. She was beautiful and had a smile on her face. Qin Anlin did not have much of an expression on his face, but there was a slight smile on his face. Yi Liangqiu's fingers gently stroked his face as he said in a low voice. He smiled. So, he was happy, right? Ah Xing stood at the side and did not dare to make a sound. Elder Missy must be feeling terrible now. Yi Liangqiu looked at him for a long time. Linda stood at the door and did not dare to come in either. Linda, bring it in. Yi Liangqiu ordered in an indifferent tone. Linda bit her lips and finally walked in slowly. She placed an invitation card on the table and said angrily, President Qin is too much. Why did he send this over when he is engaged? Yi Liangqiu reached out to take it, but Linda was a little forceful and wouldn't let go. Bring it over. Yi Liangqiu said softly. Linda bit her lips. I just can't accept it. She finally let go of it. Yi Liangqiu opened it and knew that it was made by Shenruo. The design of the invitation card was quite feminine. In order to highlight her status in the art world, she specially hired a master to design it. It was quite unique. However, she would not have the chance to go to the venue. She, Yi Liangqiu, was not that generous. She lowered her head and threw the invitation card into the trash can. Then, she said to Linda, clear the time tomorrow. Linda nodded. Actually, Mr. Yi did not have much work to do now. Not to mention a day, it would not be a problem even if he was free for a year. Linda always felt that it was not worth it. However, seeing that Mr. Yi was unhappy, she did not dare to say anything more. She went to make the arrangements. Yi Liangqiu picked up her phone and looked at it for a while. Then, she finally dialed Qin Anlin's phone number. It was not him who picked up the phone. It was Shenruo. Shenruo must have known it was her, and her voice was deliberately soft. Miss Yi, are you looking for Anlin? Yi Liangqiu's voice was a little hoarse. Regardless of whether Qin Anlin loved Shenruo in his heart or not, he had gotten engaged in a fit of pique. Shenruo was his fiancée, so there was no way she, Yi Liangqiu, could stand on her own 2 feet. Shenruo bit her lower lip and her breathing became a little erratic. We went to take a shower. Shenruo made a strange sound and Yi Liangqiu felt that it was unbearable and immediately hung up the phone. Her heart was beating so fast that it felt like it was sinking. It was extremely uncomfortable. She had long expected this day to come, but when it came, she was in so much pain. Only then did she realize that this path was far more difficult than she had imagined. There were too many crazy imaginations in her mind. She almost went crazy. She tried her best to convince herself, but she still cried. Anlin, when he heard that unbearable recording, did he also feel this much pain? However, she could only watch him in pain and could not explain. On the other side, Qin Anlin came out of the club's bathroom, wearing a bathrobe. 10 minutes ago, Shenruo's cup of coffee had soaked his clothes. He could only find a room at the last minute. When he came out, he heard her on the phone. He did not know what was going on, but he bent down and kissed Shenruo's lips. Shenruo screamed. She must have known. Then she must be in pain. Chapter 1776. Shenruo looked at Qin Anlin in a daze. She was still holding his phone with one hand and covering her face with the other. Her eyes were wide open, and she just stared at him blankly. What's wrong? Are you in a daze? He smiled and bent down to pick up the phone. Who called? Shenruo finally came back to her senses and said, It's Yi Liangqiu, but she hung up the phone. Women were always a little more thoughtful, and Shenruo was no exception. Seeing his indifferent expression, it seemed that he didn't want to go further, so she pursed her lips and whispered, Maybe she was unhappy when she heard you kiss me. Really? Qin Anlin picked up the phone and looked through it casually. He found Yi Liangqiu's call record and called back. Shenruo kept staring at him. After seeing him call Yi Liangqiu, she felt a little uncomfortable, but she didn't dare to stop him. In this relationship, she and Qin Anlin were never on the same level. Shenruo combed her hair and said generously, I'll go to the bathroom. Qin Anlin had already walked to the French window with his phone in hand. He glanced at Shenruo, and she went into the bathroom. When he reached the French window, the phone was connected, but the other side didn't answer immediately. Qin Anlin was also waiting patiently. After about 5 rings, the other side answered. It was Yi Liangqiu's voice. President Qin? It's me. His voice was a little low and calm, not as radical as before. Shen Ruo said that you were looking for me? Shen Ruo. Yi Liangqiu took a deep breath and said, This Friday, I want to see Mu Yun and little Mumu. Is it convenient for you? She thought that he would make things difficult for her, but he didn't. He didn't even think about it. I'll go to Shen Ruo's house on Friday. You can go to the apartment. Aunt Su will also be there. Yi Liangqiu agreed in a low voice and didn't refuse. No one knew what he suddenly thought of, but he added, After Shen Ruo and I get married, we won't be staying there. We'll renovate another house, so there's no need to feel burdened if we go there, because Shen Ruo won't be there. Yi Liangqiu didn't speak again and hung up the phone. On the other side, Qin Anlin looked at his phone and sneered. His temper is still so bad. At this moment, the bathroom door opened and Shen Ruo walked out. She had also changed into a bathrobe and the smell on her body was the same as his. Qin Anlin was not a blockhead. He used to be a playboy. At this moment, how could he not know what Shen Ruo was thinking? They had been dating for almost 2 months, but other than necessary social activities, they had never had intimate contact. Now that she was hinting to him, how could he not understand? A trace of contradiction flashed through Qin Anlin's heart. Finally, he leaned forward and kissed the corner of Shen Ruo's mouth. At that moment, he wanted to fulfill her wish and have her. From then on, he would have nothing to do with Yi Liangqiu. However, as soon as his lips touched the corner of her mouth, he instinctively rejected it, or rather, he lost interest. He didn't have the mood. Shen Ruo closed her eyes and waited for his kiss, but after a while, he stopped again. She was full of anticipation, so she opened her eyes and looked at him with a puzzled gaze. What's wrong? Qin Anlin reached out to adjust her neckline and smiled faintly. Forget it, let's keep it as a newlywed. Chapter 1777. She hugged his arm and pressed her face against his arm. She said softly, Anlan, you have to be gentle. He knew what she was going to say even if she didn't say it. It was Shen Ruo's first time. Qin Anlin was a little stunned. He had actually thought of Yi Liangqiu's first time. She had laid in his arms, clearly in pain, but she had endured it with all her might. From the beginning, she had a purpose. Until now, they were finished. He had once believed that she loved him. But now, he couldn't understand her. He didn't even know what she wanted. He was probably distracted by the thought of her. Shen Ruo could sense his absent-mindedness, so she bit her lower lip and moved away. She was a little sad. He couldn't let go of Yi Liangqiu. She forced a smile. Anlin, don't forget about the engagement ceremony on Saturday. Qin Anlin snapped back to reality and looked at Shen Ruo's face, which was about to cry. He suddenly realized that he had let down the girl in front of him. He didn't love her, but she was a pure and innocent girl who was good to the 2 kids. He felt a little guilty. He hesitated for a moment before reaching out and caressing her face. How could I forget? I'll pick you up that afternoon. Shen Ruo was in a much better mood. He patted her. Rest here for a while. I have something to do, so I'll leave first. Shen Ruo was a little reluctant. It was rare for him to speak to her so warmly. But he probably liked obedient women, so she nodded and stayed. Qin Anlin waited for Kaim to bring clothes over, and he changed into them before leaving. The 2 of them were in the car, and Kaim drove for a while before asking hesitantly, You and Miss Shin, are you asking or are you asking on behalf of Yi Liangqiu? Qin Anlin sat in the back seat with his eyes closed. But Kaim could tell that President Qin wasn't happy. Even though they were getting engaged, he didn't look happy at all. Why bother? If you don't love me, why are you getting engaged or even getting married? Kaim was close to him, so he dared to say this. Qin Anlin turned his head, glanced at Kaim, and then smiled faintly. I need a wife, and Mu Yun and Mumu need a mother to take care of them. Shen Ruo is good. Then, do you need her? Kaim asked calmly. Qin Anlin didn't answer. Instead, he continued to say as he wished, She and I won't have children. 3 children are enough. Kaim hesitated for a moment before asking softly, "If you're not going to give her a child, are you going to give her an ex-life? Don't tell me you won't even give me this?" If he didn't give it to her, he might as well not get married. Wasn't he using money to hire a nanny? Was President Qin lying to the little girl or to himself? He just wanted to prove that he could still live a good life without Yi Liangqiu. He wanted to prove that he could still find someone else. Wasn't there only one Yi Liangqiu in the world who could give him everything? And Kaim's question really stumped Qin Anlin. He did hesitate for a long time. He looked sideways at Kaim. "You haven't thought about it yet?" Kaim smiled. "Don't tell me you're getting cold feet?" Qin Anlin's face paled for a good while when he said this. He was right on target. It turned out that she was right. Kaim smiled. Qin Anlin, on the other hand, was a little annoyed. He didn't think it was a big problem. He just wanted to deal with a woman. How could he not be able to deal with her? But in the end, he really couldn't do as he wished. Chapter 1778. When Yi Liangqiu went there on Friday, she thought that she would only see Aunt Sue and the children. But when the door opened, she was stunned. It was Qin Anlin who opened the door. The warm light in the living room poured out, and he was standing against the light, so his expression was a little gloomy, which formed a sharp contrast with the warm light. Yi Liangqiu looked at him quietly, and so did he. Amidst the silence, after a long time, he said indifferently, "Come in." He turned around and walked in first. Yi Liangqiu followed behind and closed the door. Mu Yun and Mumu were very happy, especially Mumu, who was almost 1 year old and was about to learn how to walk. She was like a bird, standing in the middle of the living room with her 2 little arms spread out to balance her body. When she stood still, she was very excited. And Qin Anlin was squatting 2 steps away, looking at his little princess gently and encouraging her to walk towards him. At first, Mumu was afraid, but looking at Papa's handsome face, he boldly took the first step and staggered. His little buttocks were chubby, and he staggered when he walked, which was very cute. After taking a step, she stopped for a moment and then looked at Papa with a cute face, asking for a hug. Qin Anlin gave her an encouraging smile. Little Mumu's little face fell, but she still staggered towards them. She was just 1 step away. When he took that step, his chubby little body threw itself into Papa's arms. He whimpered and hugged Qin Anlin with extreme bliss. Qin Anlin's face was also full of gentleness. He was dressed like a home, only wearing a beige sweater and black casual pants. Little Mumu secretly rubbed his little nose against his sleeve, but he didn't mind. After praising and comforting his little darling, Qin Anlin looked up with a slightly cold gaze. "You don't have to worry too much. Mumu already knows how to walk. In the future, she will also know how to talk, and she will also learn to comb her hair and go to school. I can teach her all of these." As he spoke, he looked at her with a burning gaze. Yi Liangqiu's eyes also felt a little warm. After a while, she said softly, "Thank you for the trouble. Shenruo will also take care of her." Qin Anlin held his daughter with 1 hand. At this time, his eyes were already cold, and he continued in a low voice, "However, no one can replace the love that mother gives her." Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes. "Anlin, why are you talking about this? Wasn't he already prepared to get engaged to Shenruo and even get married soon? Why bother?" He repeated her words softly. After a while, he smiled. "Yes, why do you have to say it? There's no need." For a moment, the atmosphere became very subtle. Yi Liangqiu was also a little embarrassed and didn't know what to say. After a while, she found a topic. "Where's Mu Yun? Is he in his room?" Qin Anlin looked into her eyes and said calmly, "Mu Yun has classes tonight. They haven't finished yet." She was a little disappointed, and then she felt a little uneasy. She wanted to take Mumu and Mu Yun to have a children's meal together. After a long time, she reached out to take Mumu. He did not object and gave the child to her. "Mu Yun will be back at about 9 o'clock. Do you want to wait?" His tone was very indifferent, and he looked at her deeply. She nodded. She held little Mumu tightly. With him around, she didn't dare to be too close to the child. Chapter 1779. She wanted to say that she had eaten, but she swallowed the words that were on the tip of her tongue. A single meal had actually made her so greedy. After Qin Anlin finished speaking, his eyes lingered on her face for a long time before he walked into the study. As soon as he left, Mumu hugged her with his soft and tender little hands, kissed her, and called her mother inarticulately. Even so, it was enough to make her happy. She pinched the little face and smiled. "Can I teach Mumu how to walk?" She hoped that she could live, but if she couldn't, then she hoped that she could accompany Mumu to take a step forward. However, Mumu only wanted to stick to his mother, and the little guy refused to take a step forward. He wanted his mother to hold him high. Yi Liangqiu had no choice but to accompany the clingy little guy. Su Qiuxiu brought out the dishes and placed them on the table, but she did not immediately return to the kitchen. She looked at Yi Liangqiu calmly. "Miss Yi, you're very considerate. You still remember to come to see the young master and the young lady." Her tone was full of mockery. Yi Liangqiu had long known that Su Qiuxiu didn't like her because of the old lady. It had been a long time since they had a good talk. Yi Liangqiu could understand Su Qiuxiu's attitude. Even if she didn't kill the old lady and she didn't mean to help Su Shiqing was related to her by blood. Because of this, she couldn't blame Su Qiuxiu. Yi Liangqiu lowered her eyes and smiled. "I'm not a good mother." Su Qiuxiu still wanted to say something, but she had already raised her eyes. "Aunt Su, I can't be a good wife, a good mother, or even a good wife." Her eyes fell gently on Mumu's face again. "The children are all young. They will forget the pain, but Anlin won't. Some pain can be endured, but some pain, even if you grow up, is unbearable. I'm like this, and so is Anlin." Her voice became low and hoarse. "Just think of it as me being selfish." Her words had probably touched Su Xiu's heart, and Su Xiu actually took another look at her. After a while, Crispy Sleeve said indifferently, "Anlin is getting engaged tomorrow. Now I really want to ask you, do you still love him?" Yi Liangqiu didn't expect her to ask this, and her gaze froze. Su didn't answer for a long time. She sighed softly and didn't force the issue. She sighed in her heart. Previously, because of what happened with the old lady, she wanted nothing more than for Anlin to immediately divorce her and find another woman. She used to think that Xia Mian was good and sensible, but she didn't expect her to be that kind of person. Shen Rua's temperament was not bad, but Su Xiu had watched Qin Anlin grow up. Ever since he decided to give up on Yi Liangqiu, he had never smiled again. Towards Shenrua, he was also indifferent. Although he was too gentle, there was not a hint of love in his eyes. If this went on, he would probably not be happy. However, they didn't know that while they were talking, Qin Anlin was standing at the door of the study. He was about to come out, but after a long time, he didn't hear Yi Liangqiu's answer, so he retreated. The door gently closed, and he stood by the window, his back lonely. There was a little red dot between his fingers, and the green smoke slowly spread into the night. In fact, he could have avoided her visit today. He had told her before that he would go to Shenrua's parents' house. But in the afternoon, he came back unexpectedly. He thought that she would care about Shenrua's phone call that day, because it was very likely that he and Shenrua had done it. But she was very calm. Chapter 1780. 10 minutes later, Su Qiuxiu knocked on the door. "Anlin, it's time to eat." Qin Anlin turned sideways and looked at the door quietly. He put out his cigarette and walked out. As soon as he went out, Su Qiuxiu smelled the cigarette on him and complained, "Why are you smoking again? Weren't you coughing badly a few days ago? The doctor said that you needed an intravenous drip, but you refused. Now you're smoking again." Once the old woman started talking, she wouldn't stop. Qin Anlin could only endure it, his good temper allowing her to continue. During the meal, the three adults were quite calm and no one said anything. There was really no need to say anything more to those who had decided to separate. Qin Anlin ate very quickly. After that, he took the car key and said, "I'm going to pick up Mu Yun." He didn't know if he was talking to Su Qiuxiu or Yi Liangqiu. After that, he opened the door and went out. With the two women around, they talked more. Su Qiuxiu looked at Yi Liangqiu and asked softly after a long time, "Have you ever regretted it?" Yi Liangqiu didn't answer directly. Instead, she smiled faintly and said, "What about you? Do you still hate me?" Similarly, this was also a difficult question for Su Qiuxiu to answer. She got up and prepared to clean up. "Let me do it," Yi Liangqiu said in a low voice and reached out to hold Su Qiuxiu's hand. Su Qiuxiu was stunned and looked at her. "I may not have the chance to do such a thing again in the future." Yi Liangqiu cleaned up neatly and her voice was still indifferent. "In the future, I'll have to ask Aunt Su to help me take care of the 3 children." Su Qiuxiu sat and felt a little strange when she heard this, but she couldn't tell what was strange about it. Take care of the 3 children for her. That's right, there were 3 children. Su Qiuxiu's brain stopped working and she didn't think much about it. She was busy taking care of Mumu. One was busy inside and the other was busy outside. It was as if they had returned to the past. When Qin Anlin came back with Mu Yun, this was the scene. He put down the key and said softly to Mu Yun, "Mom is in the kitchen." Mu Yun put down the piano and headed for the kitchen. Qin Anlin was also standing at the kitchen door, watching Yi Liangqiu stand in front of the sink in an apron. Her long hair was tied up, and she was focused on washing the dishes. The faint yellow light and the faint wine on top of her head seemed to have enveloped her in a faint halo, making her look very gentle. Qin Anlin leaned there and watched as she touched Mu Yun's head and washed an apple for Mu Yun. If he was not sober, he would think that she was still his wife. He stood there until she looked at him, and then he retreated. Throughout the night, Qin Anlin stayed in the study. Yi Liangqiu held Mumu in her arms and accompanied Mu Yun to read. Mu Yun did not ask about her and Qin Anlin, nor did he mention Shenruo. He just stayed quiet. He just felt that his mother would still be there. Yi Liangqiu accompanied him. Such ordinary companionship was also extremely luxurious for her. She accompanied Mu Yun to finish his homework and took care of the 2 children to sleep. Before Mu Yun fell asleep, he took her hand and asked, "Mom, will you come back next week?" Yi Liangqiu lowered her eyes, held back the heat in her eyes, and forced a smile. "Yes." Only then did Mu Yun fall asleep peacefully, holding little Mumu beside him with one hand. Yi Liangqiu watched for an hour and did not have the face to stay any longer. Before leaving, she went to say goodbye to Qin Anlin. He stood in the study. When she pushed the door open, it was filled with the smell of smoke. Chapter 1781. Do you still care? He smiled faintly but didn't turn around. "I'll take care of myself." She walked towards him slowly and hugged him from behind when he was caught off guard. He froze for a moment but didn't push her away. "Yi Liangqiu, what's the meaning of this?" he asked mildly. She buried her face in his back and choked with sobs. "Anlin, you have to take care of yourself in the future." His body stiffened even more. Because he didn't even have the right to say, "How can I take care of myself without you?" She hugged him tighter and heard him say, "Liangqiu, take care of yourself." She hummed softly and finally let go of him. Slowly she stepped back. She took a deep breath and turned her head slowly. She left decisively because if she didn't leave now, she was afraid that she wouldn't be able to stop herself from looking back. Some things had to be done by someone. It had to be her or Anlin. There had to be one. She would rather it be herself. Retreating step by step, she looked at his back and silently said goodbye. "Anlin, if I survive, I will work hard to make you forgive me, work hard to snatch you back." Even if she was selfish or a bad woman, she had to be with him. She didn't care what others said. She just wanted him to be well. When she reached the door, she couldn't help but look back. So did he. Their eyes met, and their gazes were equally bitter. After a long while, he said mildly, "Be careful when you go back." She replied with a and didn't leave immediately. She just looked at his face. She realized that the person she couldn't bear to part with the most was not the child, but him. He pursed his lips and raised his hand. "Let's go." With that he turned around. He was unwilling and couldn't bear to look at her anymore. If he continued to look at her, he would probably change his mind. That wasn't what he wanted to see. Finally, the door closed gently. Qin Anlin turned his head abruptly. His eyes were bloodshot and she could vaguely see that there was a layer of water in them. He looked at the door for a long time and suddenly laughed softly. The weather was sunny in April. The clouds floating in the sky were soft and limp, and the wind was gentle. But in the Su residence, it was as cold as winter. Su Shurching sat on the sofa with a cane in his hand. His skinny fingers kept tapping on the cane. Liangqiu, it's time. He looked at the expressionless Yi Liangqiu and smiled strangely. Now, you might have to suffer a little. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. For ATV, it's not a grievance. Su Shurching still had the cheek to say, Dad admires your deep sense of righteousness. He placed his hand on his cane and looked at Jing Kong outside. He suddenly sighed. I wonder if Qin Anlin will give up on King Entertainment for you. He actually had a 50% chance of doing this. After all, Liangqiu had gone to Qin Anlin's place a few days ago and Qin Anlin had slept with her. This meant that Qin Anlin wouldn't be able to escape from Liangqiu. Being engaged to another woman wasn't a big deal. If Liangqiu was in danger, he wouldn't stand by and do nothing. Su Shurching raised his hand and his men immediately tied Yi Liangqiu's hands behind her back. They also covered her mouth to prevent her from speaking. Even Xing wasn't spared. They were tied up together and pressed onto the ground. Su Shurching stood up. He had never been so high-spirited. Chapter 1782. He was finally going to get his hands on King Entertainment. He wanted to tell Hong Ku that he had gotten everything. He had gotten her and her life's work. A man like Qin Pei was just a good-for-nothing. Not only physically, but also mentally. He looked at Yi Liangqiu and Xing, who were sitting on the floor, and a vicious glint flashed past his eyes. After this incident, they would not be able to stay. This was a scheme, but regardless of whether he had shares or not, he would still kill them. If she had to blame someone, she could only blame herself for being disobedient. Such a daughter was too difficult to control. Why not? Su Shurching stood in the afternoon sun and asked his underling, What time is it now? It's 4, Mr. Su, his underling replied calmly. Su Shurching nodded and smiled. Looks like the engagement is about to begin. Call Qin Anlin and tell him that Yi Liangqiu is in my hands. If he doesn't come on time, I will kill his woman. His voice was vicious. At that moment, Yi Liangqiu and Xing looked at each other. They were sure that Su Shurching was really going to silence them. No matter what the outcome was, Su Shurching walked out slowly. There were about 20 people standing outside. He turned around and said softly, Bring Elder Miss to my place and watch her. And Xing too. This was just an empty fort stratagem. If Qin Anlin cared about Liangqiu, he would obediently do as he said. After a while, Yi Liangqiu and Xing were stuffed into a black limousine. Before they left, a photo was taken and sent directly to Qin Anlin's phone. Then, they called Qin Anlin's phone, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get through. This was a big joke. Before Qin Anlin and Shenrua's engagement, he was in the lounge. Although it was an engagement, he was still dealing with work. In the middle of it, Keim called him out, so the phone that he had picked up earlier was placed on the table. Shenrua happened to be there and received the photo. That was a photo of Yi Liangqiu being tied up. She had sent it to Qin Anlin's mobile phone in exchange for Qin Anlin's condition. No matter what the conditions were, they were all disadvantageous to Shenrua. At the very least, today's engagement was cancelled. Shenrua looked at the photo for a long time. Her fingers trembled as she finally deleted the photo. Then she turned off Qin Anlin's phone and threw it under the sofa. In this way, their engagement would not be interrupted. As for Yi Liangqiu, she felt that it was still that woman's trick. She just wanted to take back Anlin. When Qin Anlin came back, Shenrua smiled at him and said, It's almost time. Let's go out. Today, Shenrua was very elegant. Her white dress showed the advantages of her figure, but Qin Anlin didn't pay much attention to it. After seeing Yi Liangqiu, what other woman could attract him? He just nodded and glanced at the table. His expression seemed to be different, but in the end he didn't say anything. He let Shenrua hold his hand and walk out of the suite. Kaim was at the door. When he saw them coming out, his expression was a bit complicated. The engagement was over, but it wasn't something that could be cancelled at will. Had President Qin really made up his mind? Compared to Qin Anlin's coldness, Shenrua seemed to be a bride-to-be. She looked shy and timid. Compared to Qin Anlin's cold face, it was quite a contrast. Chapter 1783. He looked around but didn't find the person he wanted to see. She didn't come. Last night, he didn't ask if she was coming and she didn't say anything. This topic was like a taboo and no one was willing to talk about it. His feelings were complicated. He didn't know if he wanted her to come or if she didn't come. If she came, did he want to see regret on her face or did he want her to take him back in a domineering manner? His heart was in turmoil and Shenrua was smiling and talking in his arms. The MC was also King Entertainment's best host and he set the mood very well. Shenrua's family was on stage and on Qin Anlin's side, it was Soft Sleeve. Qin Anlin thought so. Soft Sleeve had always hoped that he could start a family and now that her wish was fulfilled, he thought she would be happy. But Soft Sleeve was on stage and didn't pay attention. Soft Sleeve was in a daze. She felt that there was something in her mind that she didn't understand. What was it? What was it? She felt that it had something to do with Yi Liangqiu. Liangqiu came over yesterday and said a few things. After she said it, she felt uneasy. What was wrong? Soft Sleeve couldn't remember. She sighed in her heart. She was old and useless after all. Just as she was about to give up, Qin Anlin held her arm and said gently, "Aunt Sue, are you not feeling well?" Soft Sleeve hesitated and nodded. "I'll sit below the stage. The lights on the stage are too bright and blinding. I can't remember anything." Qin Anlin's heart skipped a beat. He felt that Aunt Sue wasn't in good spirits recently. He personally helped Aunt Sue down and helped her sit down. His attitude was there. The Shen family naturally didn't dare to underestimate Soft Sleeve's position in the Qin family. One had to know that when Soft Sleeve went on stage, the Shen family wasn't happy. There was no direct descendant of the Qin family, but any elder from the collateral branch going on stage was much more dignified than a servant. But since Qin Anlin insisted, they didn't dare to say much. The Shen family's parents were already planning in their hearts. In the future, when their daughter marries over, she would have to show the aura of a wife and not be controlled by the servants. Crispy Sleeve naturally knew what Qin Anlin was thinking and patted the back of his hand. "You're considerate. I don't have much. I've lived for a long time. It's better for me to return to the countryside in the future." Qin Anlin comforted her gently. Everyone on and off the stage was surprised. Wasn't this an engagement? Why wasn't he going on stage? The bride and her family were left hanging on the stage as if they were watching a show. When Soft Sleeve heard Qin Anlin's words, she suddenly thought of something. "Oh right, Momo, did you pick Momo up?" Silence. Qin Anlin's eyes dimmed. "Momo is in the Qin family." Soft Sleeve's expression was a little strange. After a long time, she said, "That's not right." Liangqiu asked me to take care of the 3 children. Momo isn't here. Qin Anlin's expression changed slightly. He reached out and grabbed Soft Sleeve's hand. His voice was slightly tense. "Aunt Sue, what did you say? Liangqiu asked you to take care of Momo?" Soft Sleeve came to her senses and nodded. "Yes, that's what she said last night. She told me to take good care of her 3 children in the future. She also told me to take care of you." As Soft Sleeve said that, her expression changed. Why did it sound like she was telling him something Qin Anlin thought of last night and the hug she gave him before she left? He had a bad feeling. Chapter 1784. Qin Anlin's expression became more and more solemn. He pursed his lips and looked at Kaim. "Contact Liangqiu immediately." Kaim was about to speak when his cell phone rang. He looked up, his expression solemn. "It's Su Shircheng." Qin Anlin took the phone and tried his best to calm himself down. When he opened his mouth, his voice was extremely hoarse. "Where is she?" A burst of maniacal laughter came from the other side of the phone, followed by Su Shircheng's gloomy voice. "If you want to know where she is, you'll have to see if President Qin is sincere." Qin Anlin's voice was brief. "What do you want?" Su Shircheng froze for a moment. He hadn't expected Qin Anlin to ask him so directly. Then he smiled smugly. "President Qin, today is your big day. Why are you so concerned about your ex-wife?" Qin Anlin's expression was as dark as still water. "Mr. Su is right. Today is my big day. There's no need to waste time and effort on unrelated people." Su Shircheng was completely stunned this time. It took him a long time to regain his composure. After a long time, he narrowed his eyes and looked at Yi Liangqiu and Xing, who were tied up at the side. He smiled sinisterly. "I don't believe that you'll leave her alone." Su Shircheng's voice was deep and slow. With a hint of greed, he said, "Write down the transfer of ownership of King Entertainment and bring it over. Otherwise, I'm afraid I'll be heartless." "That photo, you should have received it, right?" "Photo?" Qin Anlin's hand touched his pocket. His cell phone seemed to have been left in the lounge and then disappeared. He gave Kaim a look. Kaim immediately got someone to dig 3 feet into the ground. The muscles on Qin Anlin's face were visibly trembling. He suppressed his voice and said, "Mr. Su, you must be joking. King Entertainment is the business of the Qin family. How could we ruin it for a woman? Moreover, if he really signed such a document, Liangqiu would probably not be able to live." Su Shircheng was naturally annoyed by his answer. He didn't expect Qin Anlin to reject him so flatly. "Do you really not care about her life or death?" he asked in a cold voice. Qin Anlin's voice was even colder than his. "I'm sorry, I have to get engaged." With that, he hung up the phone. At that moment, Kaim brought his phone over and said in a low voice, "I found it under the sofa." Qin Anlin's eyes fell on Shenrua on the stage. Shenrua's lips moved slightly. After a long time, she squeezed out a sentence, "Anlin, we're getting engaged today. I don't want to be disturbed by anyone." She was selfish, but her selfishness was normal. Yi Liangqiu had divorced him. It was not normal for her to cling to him like this. Shenrua felt that she had done nothing wrong, but she felt lonely standing on the stage. When he said he wanted to get engaged, she was filled with joy. She thought she had waited for what she wanted. But in the end, he only had Yi Liangqiu in his heart. This almost drove her crazy. Qin Anlin looked at her, but he ordered Kaim, word by word, "Prepare the car. Also, prepare the documents. I'll leave first. Follow me when you're done." He didn't hesitate. At that moment, his mother's death was gone, and he didn't hate her. At that moment, he knew that as long as this woman was in danger, he wouldn't hesitate even if he had to use everything he had, even his life. As he walked out, he pulled off his bow tie and unbuttoned 2 buttons on his shirt. Chapter 1785. All of this had happened in front of everyone. Just like his love for Yi Liangqiu, so intense, passionate, and unreserved. "Anlin!" Shenrua let out a heart-wrenching scream. Her body shook and trembled. She couldn't believe that he had really abandoned her just like that. He had brought everything he had to look for Yi Liangqiu. His career, his feelings, and his life. "Do you really care about her that much?" Shenrua's lips curled into a faint smile. All her hopes for the future, were gone. At this moment, it had completely disappeared. Shenrua rushed down and hugged Qin Anlin from behind. She buried her face in his back and sobbed. "Anlin, this might be a conspiracy, and the mastermind might be herself. Why do you always believe her? Over and over again. Have you forgotten how she hurt you?" Qin Anlin's fingers moved her away bit by bit. He didn't blame her for hiding her phone. She wasn't wrong. Because human feelings were selfish, and the life and death of others had nothing to do with them. However, he couldn't ignore Yi Liangqiu. Even if the world came to an end, even if they broke up 100 times, he still had to care about her. Because she was the girl who had been scared to death the first time they had been together. She was the first girl who had dared to scheme against him. She was the girl who had hidden away for so many years when she was pregnant. Yes, the woman who had given birth to 3 of his children. How could he ignore her? Yes, it might be a conspiracy. Qin Anlin raised his head slightly. But even if she's in danger, I can't ignore her. Finally, he broke free from her, pushed her aside, and walked quickly out of the hall. Behind him, about 30 people followed. Keim quickly went to prepare the documents. He was hesitant at first, but after seeing President Qin's expression, he didn't hesitate anymore and directly printed the documents. On the other side, Su Shircheng put down his phone. His face was gloomy and scary. Qin Anlin had rejected her. He had rejected her mercilessly. How could he accept this? Holding the phone, he walked toward his daughter step by step. He squatted down and said in a voice so soft that it made her hair stand on end, "Did you hear that? He has abandoned you. I don't want you anymore. I'm going to get engaged to another woman. Didn't you say that you two made up in the apartment last time? Didn't you say that he still cares about you?" His voice became colder and colder. "You dare to fool me?" Yi Liangqiu and A Xing sat with their backs facing each other. Their limbs were tied up. She sneered. "Do you think he will still love me after his mother passed away? You're the one who killed his mother. He and I are destined to never be together. What's more, handing over King Entertainment with both hands." Yi Liangqiu's eyes were as cold as ice. Su Shircheng laughed sinisterly. After a moment, he said, "Very good. So, this plan was also part of your plan? For what?" He paced back and forth in front of her, stroking his chin with his fingers. "Let me think. You're doing this because you want to fight to the death with me. But have you ever thought that Qin Pei is still in my hands? And that I should tell Qin Anlin the truth about his mother's death right now? That you're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.